What are they booing about? Well, I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. In this episode, I spoke with Andrea Jain, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Indiana University in Indianapolis, about her new book, Peace, Love, Yoga, The Politics of Global Spirituality, published recently by Oxford University Press. Our conversation explores how modern commodified yoga serves a neoliberal agenda by subverting and containing social activism and political dissent, something that she calls gestural subversion. As a religious studies scholar, Andrea takes modern yoga seriously, viewing its practitioners not as passive dupes, but people with agency, but whose identities have been shaped and formed to serve neoliberal ends. We touch on a range of topics and issues, from the feel-good neoliberal discourse of yogaware, such as the company Spiritual Gangster and its clothing products, cultural appropriation, the contested claims of spiritual authenticity, the global spread of capitalism, where even in India, neoliberal forces have led to coopting yoga for extremist and exclusionary nationalist agenda, as well as QAnon's followers' attraction to yoga, and much more. Andrea is also author of a previous book, Selling Yoga from Counterculture to Pop Culture, also published by Oxford University Press, and she is currently the editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. Her areas of research include religion and capitalism, global spirituality and modern yoga, the intersections of gender, sexuality and religion, and theories of religion. This is a really lively interview. I hope you enjoy it. Please leave us feedback if you get a chance on Apple Music, iTunes, Amazon Music. And thanks for listening. I'm really pleased to welcome Andrea Jain to the Mindful Cranks podcast. She just published a remarkable book by Oxford University Press. Its title is Peace, Love, Yoga, The Politics of Global Spirituality. And she's published many other books, Selling Yoga. Today we're going to focus on this new book. So welcome, Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I think we first met back in November, 2019, when we were at the American Academy of Religion. We were on a panel together.
That's right. That's the first time we met in person.
That was with David McMahon, and we were talking about Candy Gunther Brown's. In fact, she's been on this podcast too, so that was fun. I like to start out in a very different way than I usually do. I'd like to begin the interview actually by starting with your concluding remarks in the case of prison yoga, because I think this comparison of spirituality, namely what you call neoliberal spirituality and forms of neoliberal spirituality like modern yoga and mindfulness, have a lot of direct parallels to mass incarceration, since they're really both products of neoliberal capitalism. And if I'm not mistaken, you actually started out intending to write a book about prison yoga, and you point out really well in your book how, and we'll get into this topic more, how these neoliberal spiritualities domesticate or kind of domesticate our resistance to neoliberal capitalism, and they end up accommodating to the existing dominant structures of oppression and systemic racism and hierarchy and everything. But obviously, wearing Lululemon tights in yoga studios is very different than those wearing orange jumpsuits practicing yoga in prisons. But there's some really common threads that you tease out. I was wondering if you might be able to unpack that a bit.
Yeah. So when I started doing my research for this book, I had had a number of conversations with yoga teachers who had gone into prisons and jails and taught yoga. And they talked about yoga in those contexts as an alternative mode of rehabilitation. And I found it compelling. And I thought this would be great to write a book about this. And I was interested in questions about empowerment and how people in prison systems were feeling empowered by yoga. And then I went through a sort of experience of disillusionment, a sort of, I suppose, loss of optimism. And that corresponded with the election of Trump and the rise to power of Narendra Modi in India and Brexit and other global developments. I became far more pessimistic about the potential for resistance in popular culture, and came to see even the ways that yoga was practiced in these so-called alternative contexts as reflecting the sort of dominant mode it took in popular culture. And so the project really turned around. It became a much more critical project. And I started to see, as you already articulated, these clear shared discourses between yoga in its most popularized forms and most commodified forms. For example, I write in the book about Lululemon and Spiritual Gangster, these very high-end yoga apparel companies. But then I end the book talking about prison yoga, where I had started in my research. And I end by saying, here's where we would think, if there's anywhere, right? If there's anywhere we might get around this problem of yoga discourses or spiritual discourses, making consumers more complacent to the forces of neoliberal capitalism. Maybe it's in these prison contexts. And I found that that's not the case, that even there, what we find is that prisoners are asked to take responsibility for their own healing. And that's the neoliberal problem with popular spirituality, is that the weight, the burden of healing is put on individual consumers, whether they be buying actual commodities, $100 yoga pants, or opting into free yoga classes. Either way, the focus is not on the structures that caused the trauma to begin with, then resulted in a person's imprisonment, but on expecting that prisoner to say, I have responsibility, I have control, when in fact, their conditions are largely determined by forces and structures that are beyond their control.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I kind of had a similar experience, because in the early days, I was kind of hoping that the corporate mindfulness programs would actually be a source of transformation and sort of a systemic diagnosis of corporate power structures. And I went through a similar phase of becoming disillusioned, because I attended the very first public offering of Search Inside Yourself. And after going through that workshop, I walked away just like you did, in a way. So that brings me to another question. I'm really curious how your book has been received by those in the yoga industry, yoga teachers, yoga practice, given its critical bent, and how it's kind of like an expose on how yoga's become entangled with neoliberalism. So I'm wondering I know it's more of a scholarly book, but have there been any responses from practitioners and yoga teachers?
Yes, well, it's still fairly new, and the book was published in July of 2020, and that was in the midst of the pandemic. And so I had a lot of speaking engagements that were postponed, and all the work everyone's doing is slowed down. So there hasn't been a whole lot of data to draw on yet. In terms of how has the book been received by yoga practitioners. That said, I have found that I have been asked to do a number of these kinds of events, these kind of interviews with yoga practitioners and people running teacher trainings. Have invited me to do these virtual conversations with teachers undergoing training. And I went on a whole speaking tour ahead of the publication of the book. I gave the Peace, Love, Yoga talk all over the country. And in every one of my talks, there's always there are always yoga practitioners present. It's usually fewer yoga practitioners than academics, but there's always a handful of them there. Mm-hmm. And I have found that, people, like their response to the Peace, Love, Yoga book, I find in a way echoes the thesis of the book. Which is that I do not think yoga consumers are blind to the problems of neoliberal capitalism. I think that they are not numbed by these commodities and dumbed down by these commodities and these consumer practices. I think they're very aware of the problems of neoliberal capitalism and they want to curtail them. But they do so through mere gestures. And so I talk about gestural subversions.
Yeah, I'd like to get to that. That's an important part of the book, I think. That I highlighted so many paragraphs around gestural subversion. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. And so that's what I find in my conversations with yoga practitioners is they tend to want to develop a relationship with the book that I would characterize as a sort of gestural subversion. They want to say, okay, so there's this real capitalist problem with spirituality, and we've got to be anti-capitalist. So how do we do that through commodification? How do we do that through our yoga studios and our yoga products?
I know exactly what you're talking about.
And, I've also talked to some some yoga practitioners who I think are thinking outside the box, and they've created real kind of radical yoga communities where there's persistent resistance to commodification. So I'm not saying it's not possible or it hasn't happened, but
they're few and far between, and they're way on the margins, aren't they?
Yeah.
Compared to the mainstream juggernaut.
That's right.
I'd like to go to the beginning of the book, and you open the book. I was struck by your personal reflections on the Women's March that you participated in almost 4 years to this day, right after Trump's inauguration. And it seems like you almost had like an epiphany of sorts that you began to associate associations of the body in our culture and its ties to the Protestant work ethic, perfectionism, self-improvement, and now what we call self-care. And I have a similar sort of response because you question whether raising up a sign with a pithy slogan was enough, and you question whether the self-proclaimed spiritual protesters, there probably were many yoga practitioners there at the Women's March, would they actually stand up and resist Trump's insane policies, or whether they would, I think you said, choose more of the easy way out through self-care. Was that a significant pivot point for you?
Yeah, Trump's election was a significant pivot point for me. I was, I think, feeling very pessimistic about the state of our country and the world. I've been quite pessimistic for a while, but I think that, and I personally, as a woman of color living in this country, I felt under threat in living here, and I was scared.
And you live in Indiana, I might mention.
Yes, exactly. And I grew up in Texas.
Uh-oh.
So, so it was scary. It was a scary place to live in and to grow up. And when Trump was elected, though, I was more scared. I felt like I remember describing it in the days after his election. I remember describing my feeling as feeling surrounded. I felt like I was surrounded by people who didn't want me to exist, and certainly didn't want me to have any power or control over anything, much less my body. So that was a real pivoting point. It was a sort of going from, feeling fragile and vulnerable and in fear for most of my life, to feeling a real immediate threat to my safety and my existence and my children's. And so it took me to a pretty apocalyptic place. I would say I went from feeling pretty pessimistic about humanity and the future of life on this planet to feeling apocalyptic.
Yeah, well, it's quite a dramatic change, isn't it? From where just one day makes. It's amazing.
Yeah.
I find a lot of similarities between our work and in the book McMindfulness. I also sort of kind of discovered neoliberalism in the process. I wasn't planning on actually having a chapter on that, but the more I got into it, the more I realized what was going on. And your book, however, is way more academic and scholarly in it than mine, and it touches on a lot of nuanced points, I think, that are worth exploring because, as you mentioned, you come from a feminist socialist perspective, at least that's one framework. And I agree with you, actually, that you don't see spiritual consumers as passive dupes, right? Passive victims, or that these techniques, these practices are numbing devices. However, I was a bit surprised, though, that you took on it people like Jeremy Carrot and Richard King. Their book, Selling Spirituality, The Corporate Takeover Religion, made a really big impact on me because, they kind of look at the history of corporatist spiritualities as also being a legacy of settler colonialism as well. And they talked about that these corporatist spiritualities have an accommodationist orientation, which sounds very similar to your critique. So in terms of how accommodationist orientation stifles, boots on the ground sort of political dissent. So what's at issue there with their work? What did you find in their work that was somewhat at odds with your perspective? I'm just trying to tease that out a bit.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with them that the problem with the commodification of yoga and other forms of spirituality is connected to the problems of colonialism. That I don't disagree with that critique, but where I'm uncomfortable with their critique is in their disregard for what seems to me their disregard for the intelligence and ability to reflect on global problems of consumers themselves. So when I was in the little background here, when I was in grad school, I didn't know I was going to write a dissertation on modern yoga. I was interested in bhakti and devotional traditions. And I found myself doing research in India one summer. And I completely unplanned, sort of ended up one day meeting a yoga guru. I started to feel I was really fascinated in conversation with this guru about the way he was teaching yoga and how much it echoed what I had heard in a college yoga class I'd taken on campus when I was an undergrad. And I thought, there was kind of this pizza effect going on, right? Where yoga had been appropriated by these white consumers. They had created this modern, globalized, consumer-oriented form of yoga, and then it returned to India. And I started to think, okay, I want to do my project on this other kind of body practice, this other kind of South Asian body practice, yoga, and understand its global commodification and the issues around colonialism and appropriation and how yoga went global. But when I started to talk to my colleagues about this, and I started to shift my focus and started to tell them, I'm not writing a dissertation on bhakti. I'm going to write about global modern yoga. And at this point, yoga studies was really dominated by white male scholars. That's changing very quickly just in the past 10 years. But when I was in grad school, it was a very white male area. And I was telling them this and really excited about my project, and they laughed at me. And they said, "Come on, Andrea, you want to focus on like white suburbanite housewives? And I thought it was deeply misogynistic.
Yeah.
Their response, like they said, they couldn't believe that as a scholar of religion, a scholar of yoga, I would take what these white suburbanite housewives were doing seriously. And I think what I heard from my yoga studies colleagues then, I heard echoed in some of the scholarship on popular spirituality, in the tone of the conversation around these consumers. And so that's the sort of feminist thrust, or one of the feminist thrusts of my work, is I see this as a religious practice, that it's a religion of consumer culture. It's dominant, it's powerful, and yeah, it's what a lot of women are doing. And that's, but we can develop very nuanced understandings of what's happening in the world today and the forces at play by focusing on what these women are doing. And so my work on yoga is really an effort to understand religion under neoliberal capitalism. And that means focusing on women's religiosity.
Well, that really clarifies it then for me. Yeah. And I also saw that you've been influenced, like myself, by Mark Fisher's work, Capitalist Realism, and along with Slavoj Zizek's observation that anti-capitalism seems to be subsumed within capitalism. And I think that brings us to this topic that you talk about a lot. So how can you tell us a little bit about how neoliberal modes of spirituality both recognize the problems with global capitalism, they try to move towards dissent, but somehow these modes of neoliberal spirituality contain it. And that's where you get into this whole notion of gestural politics and gestural subversion, right?
Yeah. So let me start for our readers. You would already know this about Fisher, but Fisher compares, or he uses as an example of the way gestural subversion works in capitalism. He uses Hollywood films. Yeah. And so, he asks his readers, how often is the villain the evil corporate entrepreneur, right? In Hollywood movies. And we watch these movies and we sympathize with the hero who's resisting the evil corporation. This is a way for a commodity to perform our subversion for us, right? And so by watching this anti-capitalist film, we're performing our anti-capitalism. We see the problem with these evil corporations. We know they're doing us harm. We know they're perpetuating inequities of all sorts and violence to our environment. Yet, and so we're uncomfortable with these feelings. We're uncomfortable with this reality, this capitalist reality. So the film performs our anti-capitalism for us. So what's happening there is we're paying to watch a film in order to perform our anti-capitalism. So we subvert through consumption, through participating in the very capitalist structures. And so likewise with spiritual commodities, we see t-shirts with peace, love, yoga printed across them. We see t-shirts with, good vibes for everyone, all like good vibes all the time. We see people buying a lot of organic yogaware, biodegradable paper plates and other commodities. And these are all efforts to, we also see, by the way, a lot of forms of charitable giving in popular spirituality. Right. And so Spiritual Gangster, for example, donates a certain percentage of all of their profits to a charitable foundation. And these whether they are through, creative packaging or discourses printed across yogaware or charitable giving, I characterize these as gestural subversions. They're performing our anti-capitalism for us. And the way we're anti-capitalism is by buying these commodities. Mm-hmm. So rather than buy, a cheap yoga t-shirt we buy the more expensive organic yogaware. Rather than buy the plastic disposable plates, we go to Whole Foods and buy the biodegradable ones. And we see this kind of gestural subversion also happening in the commodification of spirituality in India itself. And so this is another way I take a sort of different path than Carrot and King's book and other works on popular spirituality. I look at global spirituality. I see this as not just a white problem, but also but a capitalist problem. And so we see it everywhere capitalism is dominant, including India, where the packaging is intentional and it's supposed to make the consumer feel like they are being resistant, right, in some way.
Yeah, and that's what puzzles me in a way, because there's probably a good many yoga teachers and yoga practitioners, and for that matter, mindfulness trainers and mindfulness practitioners, that many that I know lean left or even progressively far left. And I don't doubt their sincerity, but yet either they seem to look the other way when it comes to the discourse and the messages of their programs and the framing of their practices, the marketing, the packaging, because they're still adhering to this very neoliberal sort of discourse. And in a way, they seem to talk the talk, but don't really walk the walk. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, why is that the case? Do you think it's due to just the nature of the fact that these practices are commodified, or that these people have financial interests that they have a stake in? And I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Well, I think it's really hard to actually engage in political activism that is effective, to really opt out of neoliberal capitalism, right? How do we even do that? I'm actually not sure.
Yeah.
This is a work in cultural diagnostics. I am diagnosing what I see as a problem with our culture. I'm not prescribing the solution.
I like that you say that. I like that you say that, because that is the sort of retort I got a lot from mindfulness teachers. When I went to conferences, I was like in the lion's den, and I'd be the token critic. And then at the end, they all would stand up. Oh, so what's your solution? And I'm like, what do you mean, what's my solution? I'm not a mindfulness teacher. I'm a cultural critic. I'm a social critic. That's your problem.
Exactly. No, I get that question everywhere I go, and I respect the question. I'm glad the book is encouraging people to ask it. But I'm not the activist. I'm the scholar, cultural diagnostician, cultural critic, and I myself, I'm uncomfortable every day with the reality we live in, but I also see neoliberal capitalism as the water I'm swimming in. And so I'm constantly struggling personally in my own effort to resist while living, right? I mean,
right. But even though you say you're a scholar, I mean, your book in itself is an intervention, because it's making people to ask these questions, and that's a change and a shift in and of itself. So
yeah, I think the work we do is necessary. The work of cultural diagnostics and the work of the cultural critic, it lays a foundation on which to build something new, right? Or it clears out the current foundation, right? We're showing the cracks, we're showing the problems, we're illuminating the problems with the system, and that must be done in order to build or even conceive of something different. So I'm not suggesting the work's not important. I do think it's necessary and important.
Yeah. Well, you did mention that you knew of some yoga teachers and that were on the margins, that were doing things that were really a lot more radical, and I know of people like that in the mindfulness world too. But those are a really hard sell to like corporations. I just can't imagine, these programs that would be radical, and they would we're going to challenge corporate norms. We're going to call into question the inequitable power structures, and I just don't see how those would even get a foothold in these kinds of systems. So what I see is sort of a flip to this kind of naive form of rationalization is that, well, if we just plant a little seed of mindfulness in these institutions, if we just plant the seeds, it's kind of a trickle down idea that one person will become mindful, the leader will become mindful, and then, somehow it'll be additive over time and there'll be this miraculous social transformation.
Right. It sounds like John Mackey's way of thinking, right?
Yeah, it's an oxymoron, conscious capitalism.
Right, exactly. But see, I think that's exactly the problem is, we are living in a world where capitalism is literally bringing about the end of the world.
Yep.
We are not going to survive much longer on this planet if we continue the way we're going, if we continue along that path. So capitalism cannot be the solution. We cannot work within the system. And so any attempt to say, to sort of compromise or say, well, how can we be alternative yet still market ourselves to corporations?
Mm-hmm.
Those questions don't make sense. Because to be anti-capitalist, right, you can't work within capitalist social structures. Yeah. And it is this book, really focuses on capitalism as a social force, not just a set of economic policies, but a way of thinking, a worldview where we burden individuals with their own situation in life. We burden them with the responsibility of their own situation in this world, in social structures, and then expect them to make good consumer choices, again, working within these very damaging and oppressive structures to somehow liberate themselves from them. It's impossible.
I'd like to touch on another topic that, and I don't really quite know how to go about this, but you talk about the problem of the claims of authenticity, this whole contested issue around, I guess it gets into the topic of cultural appropriation somewhat, which we could talk about that more later too. But I have gotten attacked by a lot of mindfulness people because I think they've misconstrued the critique that I've been trying to. They sort of want to pigeonhole me into being, oh, you're just a fundamentalist Buddhist who wants to say that there's a more authentic form of mindfulness from the Buddhist tradition, but that's really not at all what I think my critique has been about. But you do take issue with this issue of authenticity. But I'd like to take an example from the mindfulness world because I know that world better. You may be familiar with this for-profit mindfulness drop-in studio in Manhattan. It was called Mindful MNDFL. And it was conceived by a couple of people and they thought, well, hey, there are drop-in studios for beauty care, so why don't we have a drop-in studio for meditation? And you can go online, and choose your cushion where you want to sit online ahead of time, and it's for profit. It may even be publicly traded. I'm not sure, but do you think this has like a flattening effect when we begin to have this false equivalency between beauty care and meditation?
Flattening in the sense that at some point there is a difference between a highly commodified form of spirituality and a less commodified or non-commodified form, it's such that one is more authentic. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, because I've seen articles online about goat yoga and beer yoga, and I'm thinking, really, you're not going to be critical that there's a difference?
Okay, so where I'm coming from is I was trained in comparative religions.
Yeah.
And I really do see all religious forms as wholly contextual.
Contextual,
So,
yeah, absolutely.
and there is no original yoga, and even if we get back to a, say, older, or as some would like to say, more authentic variety, they have equally deep problems,
Oh
like
yeah.
patriarchy,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
And some of the most ancient yoga systems, when you read those texts and about the way the female body was conceptualized as a center of violence
Yeah, you shouldn't be
and
reincarnated
sex.
as a female and all that, right? All that sort of
Right.
mythology.
So I'm very resistant to arguments about authenticity, because I see all arguments for authenticity or against authenticity as power based, right? Somebody's being excluded here as lesser than.
True. Yeah.
And that is the case whether we're looking at a yoga system from 500 years ago, or goat yoga, right? We're in either case, once you start talking about origins or authenticity, I think it's about power.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that makes me really uncomfortable. So that's why I'm resistant to that. It's that those debates were taking place throughout the history of yoga. At every stage in the history of yoga practitioners were arguing about who had the real practice, the authentic practice, the right practice.
Yeah.
And so it's not a new debate. It's
Oh
not a
no.
new conversation.
Yeah.
And it's in every area of the history of religions, right? This is about the history of religions is about the history of disagreement and debate and
Yeah.
argument.
Yeah. In Buddhism, we have the one true Dharma and all that.
Right. So that's where I'm coming from. There is this sort of radical position that sees all forms of religion and spirituality as historically and socially contextual and contextualized, and always in flux and always in debate and contestation. And I don't want to privilege one as less in contestation, because then I think it's about a sort of power grab.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a difference there between doing that and saying something that goes along the line that, we're not romanticizing or advocating that there's some sort of authentic tradition or authentic form of yoga or mindfulness, but there is a difference between saying, advocating, taking a claim on authenticity versus saying, we might need to have a dialogue with different ideas, Western progressive ideas. I think the critique that I've offered, as I said, has been sort of been dismissed by mindfulness teachers as I'm just trying to, advocate a fundamentalist Buddhist position of authenticity. But really saying, no, I think what we're trying to do is to have a dialogue with Western progressive ideas, even Judeo-Christian ideas of, the prophetic tradition that we don't have in the East. But I find it kind of ironic that many proponents in the mindfulness movement seem to make claims of authenticity of their own by saying, "Oh, we as Westerners, we know better than those quaint Asian, monks, and we have the scientific method, and we've been able to extract the real universal essence of the Dharma." And in a way, that's kind of, in my opinion, like a secular revelation of the original Buddhism before the so-called Asian cultural baggage tainted it. And so do you see the discourse claims that, around this idea of extracting the essence of a historical tradition, this whole universalizing discourse is just kind of a slicker way of claiming authenticity?
Yeah, it's like how so-called secular discourses are ways of claiming a form of superiority, cultural superiority, and they're ultimately about exclusion, right? I think the questions we need to ask is not what's the authentic practice,
Mm-hmm.
but who's being excluded from the practice, or who's being oppressed by the practice,
Yeah.
or what oppressive or damaging social structures are being perpetuated
Yes.
by the practice.
Yes.
And so I absolutely am uncomfortable with a lot of the dynamics of cultural appropriation as they occur in popular spirituality. But my concern is not with where's the authentic practice that's lost. It's how does cultural appropriation perpetuate colonialism, colonialist discourses, racist discourses? And how does the way that we very carefully select from India the imagery we're comfortable with, the imagery that sells well, how does it romanticize Indian culture in a way that is infantilizing? And was used by and is used today by imperialist forces to legitimize all kinds of oppression and inequity.
Mm. Yeah. And you also touch on in the book a little bit on feminism and how even that's been co-opted by neoliberalism, and how it's infected these spiritual discourses. How it's kind of co-opted these terms like empowerment and liberation. And I remember when the book, was it Sheryl Sanders who came out with that book, Lean In? Mm-hmm. I was so repulsed by that. And then there is a counter book that came out actually by a British lady, Dawn Lepore, I think. It was called Lean Out. It was kind of a counter book to her book. But you do a really good job of pointing out how mainstream neoliberal feminism kind of aids and abets the capitalist project now.
Right. So I also wrote this book while raising two young children. When Peace, Love, Yoga was published, I had a baby at home and was pregnant with my second child. And when Selling Yoga, was published. So my first book. And so when I was writing Peace, Love, Yoga, I had my second child and had these two very small children at home. And this was very, my personal experience of motherhood was helpful in illuminating my understanding of the commodification of feminism. Here I had these two small children. One of whom, my older son, is neurodivergent. He's on the autism spectrum. And I was working very hard in a discipline that is dominated by men. And it is not very accommodating generally to mothers. And so I felt like it was, a constant battle to, for example, breastfeed, and go to the conferences I was expected to go to the meetings I was expected to go to. And so this really helped me really think about this sort of lean in way of thinking. Like, we as women are supposed to just work harder to be able to be empowered as mothers and professionals. I was desperately asking for my institution's support, my colleagues' support, and it was hard to get that support. And so I talk in the book, I give the example of a mom who is overworked, exhausted, seriously sleep deprived. And she, people see this in her, they see the problem. She's overworked. So they offer her a free yoga class during the lunch hour, right? Take a yoga class, study mindfulness. This is the solution to your problem. Well, this isn't a structural intervention. A structural intervention would be something like extended maternity leave or childcare at the workplace. These are structural interventions, which women are not offered nearly to the extent they should be, if our goal was really equity in the workplace.
Yeah, well, and that's the insidiousness of the neoliberal discourse, which infects and individualizes all social and structural and political problems. And I'd like to touch briefly on a different topic, but it's very related. The guru sex scandals that you go into. And in one of your chapters, you cover a number of very high-profile yoga teachers and these sex scandals, as well as some other more subtle cases of sexual violence. I'd like to call into question. I like how you call into question that the standard explanation for these sex scandals, which I've heard many times. They say, well, it's just the flawed guru model, the devotion to the guru. And so can you explain this more? And you have a very different way of looking at these sex scandals, not this kind of reductionistic, it's an individualized problem, it's the guru problem, right?
Yeah, so I see that argument as deeply Orientalist. Again, it's rooted in this conception of the East as highly sexualized and less controlled and less democratic, and the West as this sort of rational, organized, democratic force that needs to be dominant over the East in order to control their sexuality. So I'm deeply troubled by these cult arguments that, these are cults, that they have cult leaders and the cult leaders are out of control. I see it, as basically saying these Indian gurus can't control their sexuality. When my concern is more with the question of how does this reflect the way sexual violence is happening all over the world and all institutions, every institution, right? So the Me Too movement brought to popular consciousness the reality that sexual violence is happening in all institutions, corporate institutions, religious institutions, family institutions. And there is a sort of corporate logic that justifies and excuses and covers up the violence of the entrepreneur, the CEO, the business leader in ways that are no different than what happens in religious or spiritual institutions. And so again, for me, the sort of the dominant framework with which I think is an anti-capitalist framework. And so I'm always thinking about how is capitalism causing a problem here? And I'm also concerned with patriarchy. And so it's as you mentioned, a sort of feminist sociologist critique. But I see patriarchy as being as a force that is now upheld by neoliberal capitalism, and so they're working as a team. They work together, and so I seek to sort of look at again the way that sexual violence is conceptualized and critiqued and talked about in a way that specifies it as if it's like a cult problem or Indian guru problem instead of this larger white corporate, neoliberal capitalist patriarchal problem, which I see it very much is. Once we start scapegoating the Indian guru, right? It's saying, oh, we don't have to critique the patriarchy. We don't have to critique neoliberal capitalism and corporate structures. We can scapegoat the Indian guru and avoid all of that, and avoid talking about how our own, how CEOs are engaging in sexual violence every day, or church leaders of more mainstream Protestant institutions are committing sexual violence every day. So yeah, that's where I'm going with that.
Yeah, that's really, it was refreshing to see that. That was a very different take.
And I mean, the president of the United States.
I was just going to say that.
Right? He rose to one of the most powerful positions in the world. Donald Trump is a self-proclaimed pussy grabber, as I describe him in my book, right? And so clearly we have a sort of this is an entrepreneur who was able to rise to the most powerful position in the world while openly proclaiming this about himself. And so to scapegoat the Indian guru just seems absurd to me.
Yeah. Well, speaking of entrepreneurship, I like to circle back a bit to kind of the central thesis in your book about neoliberal spirituality, and you bring up the company. I'm not in the yoga world, but Spiritual Gangster is the name of the company. I was like, what? Some yogaware company that sells a lot of T-shirts and clothing, with text on them, what you call "do good" slogans imprinted on the clothing. And so, how does this whole phenomena, this yogaware, fit into your cultural diagnosis then about neoliberal spirituality?
Well, Spiritual Gangster itself, right? If we just think about the name of the company, which, by the way, much of the Spiritual Gangster yoga wear has Spiritual Gangster printed across it. That expression itself has been widely consumed and commodified and consumed. And that itself is a sort of gestural subversion, right? Here we have largely white consumers buying very expensive yoga wear with Spiritual Gangster printed across it. Gangster, this term that is itself a form of resistance in Black communities, right? A form of resistance to systemic racism. And we are co-opting that and claiming it, it's right?
Like double co-opted, or maybe triple co-opted.
Right, like I'm the real gangster, right? I'm so radical. And it's deeply troubling and offensive from a race perspective, but also a sort of perspective of anti-capitalism, that you can somehow resist capitalism through capitalist consumption. And so, other examples besides Spiritual Gangster itself are good karma appliqued across the butt of yoga pants. Again, this sort of very crass form of spiritual commodification, rooted in absolutely no understanding of this Sanskrit term karma and where it comes from or what it means. Yet this feeling good about one's consumer choice, right? As if by buying this product, you're sending out good karma, like whatever that means, like for yourself or for your community, you're creating this somehow, this good thing. You're helping somehow. And so that's where, I find that the yoga wear industry is particularly a particularly important site of analysis, right, for understanding spiritual consumers. Because as a scholar of religion, I'm interested in texts, right? And I just happen to be interested in the texts of spiritual commodities. And so I look at the what's appliqued across yoga T-shirts, whether they're from a high-end yoga wear company like Spiritual Gangster, which is sold in Saks Fifth Avenue, or the stuff you can get at Target. All of that is religious text that is begging for my analysis. And that's what I'm doing in those parts of Peace, Love, Yoga.
Yeah, and because your book is global, and there's another spiritual entrepreneur who I've never heard of as well, Baba Ramdev, and his very successful company, another appropriation here, Pantajali Ayurved. And so his company is $1.5 billion in sales in 2017. Tell us about him and why his activities matter to your textual analysis.
Yeah, so one of the things I was really trying to do in this book was to say that the commodification of yoga, the white appropriation of yoga, it's not just a white American problem or North American problem or even a Western problem. Again, neoliberal capitalism is a global problem. And the commodification of yoga is happening everywhere where capitalism is dominant. And so if we look at the commodification of yoga in India, we also see it in service to neoliberal capitalist forces and government policies and government leadership. Mm-hmm. And we see it as also deeply patriarchal. And so Baba Ramdev is a close spiritual ally and has been described as a spiritual advisor to the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi. Narendra Modi is a neoliberal capitalist. He is deeply committed to free market policies in India, which have been very problematic for lower socioeconomic classes in India. He's also very conservative socially and has not done anything to prevent the criminalization of LGBTQ Indians. And there's been enormous violence against LGBTQ Indians during his leadership. Baba Ramdev has been very active in criminalizing homosexuality and transsexuality in India. And again, this is the spiritual advisor to the prime minister. He has said homosexuality is a disease, and he prescribed yoga as the cure. So here again, you have the commodification of yoga. You can pay to go to one of his very expensive yoga retreats to cure yourself of homosexuality.
And he even claimed it treated AIDS and HIV.
Yes, and by the way, COVID.
Oh, come on.
No, I'm not joking. At the start of the COVID pandemic, Baba Ramdev said people need to do yoga to prevent and treat COVID.
I don't know which is worse, bleach or
yeah, right. But they are very Trump-like.
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's why Trump was, buddy with Modi, right?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And so another thing that Modi and Ramdev have done is they've worked together to establish this International Day of Yoga, which you think, what could possibly be wrong with this?
Yeah, what's the harm? Yeah, that sounds good.
Right. But the problem is that the way it's being enforced in India, the government has distributed an actual yoga protocol, a manual for how yoga is to be taught and practiced on Yoga Day and also throughout the year at public schools, for police officers, military. And they frame yoga as Hindu. And this is connected to a sort of Hindu right-wing ideology that says, Muslims aren't real Indians, Christians aren't real Indians.
A nativist nationalist identity.
It's very exclusive. And so it's not that yoga is the problem, it's this type of yoga, this neoliberal capitalist and Hindu right-wing and patriarchal kind of yoga. So, my interest is really in looking at the ways that whether we're talking about the United States, Western Europe, India, in what ways is yoga serving to uphold the patriarchy, to uphold neoliberal capitalist social structures? And I see the same thing happening in India as it's happening in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very interesting and problematic throughout history, this whole symbiosis between religion and politics. And undoubtedly, I'm sure you've been taking notice of the rise of QAnon and the attraction of its followers to yoga and wellness and spirituality. And it seems like there's even kind of a strong parallel case here to Ramdev, and because they're both kind of using false and misleading information. If you look at QAnon's post on social media, spreading all this misinformation about COVID, and it's a hoax, it's a government scheme to microchip everyone with vaccines and so on. So I'm wondering, what's your take on this whole attraction, do you think, of QAnon to yoga and wellness? And I mean, just look at the iconic image of the insurrection of the QAnon shaman who is there.
Well, I think that if you look closely at the discourses of right-wing institutions, conservative institutions, patriarchal institutions, and you also look at the discourses of some of these very oftentimes thought of as more leftist or liberal forms of spirituality, what they share are these purifying discourses, right? This emphasis on purification.
Yeah.
Like, we can get at some kind of pure self, pure body, pure society. And these discourses of purity are deeply dangerous because they demarcate insiders versus outsiders.
Well, I think the SS and Hitler and they were very interested in yoga. too.
Yes, right, exactly. And they were, interested in all sorts of practices that were meant to cleanse and purify and get rid of pollution, basically.
Pure Aryan race, yeah.
But this is again, from a sort of religious studies perspective where I'm trained, this is a classic form of a way in which societies demarcate power is through marking those who are pure versus impure, pure versus polluted, right? And so it's a way of creating and maintaining power structures.
So, as we wrap up, we did kind of touch on this a little bit, but do you think there's any potential for any kind of new wave of spirituality that is more of an expression of anti-capitalism or post-capitalism?
I think that we are going to have a sort of radical revolution. I come at this, at our current state of affairs from a very deeply socialist perspective that says that, basically has hope only in a radical revolution that I'm not sure where it could come from or what it would look like. But we have no, it's not reasonable to hope if it's not extreme change. Immediate extreme change, because the fact is we are, from just simply an environmental perspective,
Right.
We're so close to being too far to turn back if we aren't even there already. Too far to turn back. So I don't really want to, as we talked about earlier, I resist prescribing like what revolution ought to look like. I leave that to the activists, leaders like Angela Davis, those people have spent, Greta Thunberg, who I talk about in my book quite a lot. They are the ones constructing solutions or interventions. Those are the ones I would turn to for how we bring about the revolution. From my perspective, I would say there's no hope but an extreme radical revolution.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Are you still the editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion?
Yes, I am.
Wow, I didn't know that until I started reading about your work, and I just mentioned to listeners that it's one of the most prestigious, if not the most prestigious, top-tier journal in the field of religious studies. I subscribe to it because I go to the conference, the American Academy of Religion, even though I'm a management professor. But my final question or questions is, do you see any role here then for the scholar as a public intellectual or for more socially engaged forms of scholarship? I'm just wondering what your thinking is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see a lot of my colleagues increasingly talking about the importance of speaking to larger audiences, multiple publics. And I think, one of the ways revolution happens is through educational campaigns. And we as scholars are responsible for figuring out how to translate the work we do to larger audiences and creating and supporting these educational campaigns. So I think that it's absolutely critical. And in terms of my role as the editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, or what we affectionately call the JAR in religious studies, I am looking more for, how can we publish scholarship that addresses the ways in which activism is a form of scholarship, right? It's taking our ideas and performing them, right? Which is what we do when we write. It's a sort of performance of ideas. It's a choreographed event. And whether we're giving a talk or we're writing an article or writing a book, in my case as an editor, I'm curating a conversation. Social justice work is also our ideas put into practice? And how can we think of this as a form of scholarship itself? And then what might that look like when we publish it, right? How can we kind of disseminate it? And so I've been asking these questions myself, and I've been talking to my colleagues. I know that many of us are thinking about these things, especially as we are more and more coming to terms with the reality that life on this planet depends on it.
Yeah, that's encouraging to hear. I basically went through a shift too, that I no longer write for journals in my field. I feel like they're a waste of time because it's not really getting into the public. It's not getting into the mainstream. It's not having the kind of impact. And I just got lucky in terms of discovering, more of a journalistic outlets and more popular mainstream outlets that are much more gratifying to me to see, more like millions of people rather than 300 people of your colleagues reading your work. So, but that's really good to hear.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
What's next for you? Any new projects, new books before we wrap up?
I wouldn't, I'm still in the preliminary stages of conceiving of what's next for me. During the pandemic, it's been hard because my children have been home e-learning. And as I mentioned earlier, I have a son on the autism spectrum. So these changes have been particularly challenging for him. So it's been very difficult for me to keep up.
Well, let me just say that, after you write a book, I think you really need time to recover.
Yeah.
And then, my experience was writing a book was easier than promoting it. It took a lot more work because that's not my world. The marketing world, being out in the public eye world is not something I enjoy. So, it takes a time to recover. I mean, from writing a major piece of work because, you have to allow your mind to kind of gestate and germinate and reflect and, have some, open time to just read things that you couldn't read before because you're constantly out under deadline, right? Is that something you felt?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, for me, especially the reading, I want to just sit and read. But one of the things that I am finding myself really drawn to is writing about, it's turning actually away from yoga for a while. I think I've said what I have to say about yoga and popular spirituality. And now I'm interested in religion and consumer culture, religion and capitalism around animal ethics.
Oh.
So I'm interested, and I'm probably going to write something on animal consumption and commodification, religion, and white supremacy. I'm interested in the sort of like the ways in which capitalist social structures, including many religious institutions, use othering discourses that sort of uphold both animal agriculture and white supremacy. And the ways that these are like perpetuating all kinds of violence.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's really necessary, important work. Well, thank you, Andrea. This was just such an enjoyable conversation to dig in to your wonderful book, Peace, Love, Yoga, The Politics of Global Spirituality. And
thank you. It was a real pleasure, Ron.
Maybe we can actually see each other in person next November. I don't know. We'll have to see.
That would be amazing.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Take care. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks.